It was quite extraordinary the way the lawyer was paid off. His fee was having Russell make a pop video of the lawyer's song. That, in a way, was the most astonishing episode in the whole film.
But, I mean, you see, I think Christopher's right. I mean, this couldn't have happened in any other country in the world. Yeah. A, whether you'd make that kind of a deal with your lawyer, and B, where your lawyer could be that kind of character.
And could have that horrible voice. I don't think that...
Or where you could find the attorney for Guccione saying, in complete seriousness, in that marvellous office with kind of modern art dripping from the walls, saying that as far as he was concerned, you know, the magazine had regularly stood up for the freedom of the press, and the cases that they had actually taken to court were vindication on behalf of the whole press of America of freedom of the press.
What about the sort of oddities in the film, like the Sikh butler of the lawyer and the Sing Sing ballet and all that? What did you make of all that?
I didn't understand that. In fact, they also had parts of the film script underneath it, Moll Flanders, which were we supposed to be making some kind of connection there? I didn't understand that. Was this supposed to be... Was Ken Russell identifying with Moll Flanders here? I couldn't figure this out.
I thought the funniest bit of Ken Russell's Moll Flanders script was, of course, we first meet Moll. There's something called the Southwark Sex Fair, and she's not selling just apples. They have to be coxes. Yeah. Mr. K was probably the most bizarre figure in the whole thing, this elderly Sikh reciting Kipling.
Yes. It's the kind of the one sort of British centre to the whole movie, except for Nigel Finch himself. We should actually say he appears, in a sense, rather, I think, like Candide, as a kind of innocent abroad in Manhattan. And I love the way in which his questions have a sort of innocence as he looks at this extraordinary, bizarre happening and poses them, you know, without any apparent value to them. He, I thought, was the kind of still centre around which swirled all these absurd goings-on, and just, in a sense, artfully assembled to give you a kaleidoscope of a lunatic project involving two lunatic titans, as you say, Lloyd.
Mark Lawson said in The Independent, said the seesaw feeling that the film induced in the viewer, by which I think he meant, did you favour Russell, did you favour Guccione? My feelings were sort of veering from one to the other. I mean, I thought they were both pretty horrible, but one's feelings weren't black and white, were they?
No, I felt very sort of equally unsympathetic towards both of the titans battling away, and in a way, especially when Ken Russell said, I think his words were, the film director is the most hard done-by person in the world.
Yes,
May I have another £75,000 for my rewrite? One couldn't get really...
I couldn't sympathise with him there either.
I think I working very hard. I found myself entirely on Russell's side from the word go. The film intended one to be him. He walked across, I imagine, Times Square, or by himself, a shambling kind of figure through the night. I was entirely on his side. And the whole issue about, you know, the freedom of a director to actually, you know, do, subject to contract, what he wants to do with the project, I thought came out of the film very clearly.
Well, you see,
very sympathetic.
Yes, but he said, didn't he, said the trouble with Guccione, he wants to have his cake and eat it, which he wanted to get Ken Russell, but also he wanted to have control over Ken Russell's. Now, it was quite clear from the contract of Guccione's lawyer was saying this, that Guccione did have control over the script, and this is what... what's his name, Russell objected to, but as Guccione said, in a court of law, if it had been before a magistrate, he would, I think, have won.
Well, I'm not qualified to judge the legal issues, and that surely wasn't what the film was about. I mean, what was so
no, but what I'm saying is I think Guccione was hard done by.
I don't think so at all. There he was in that marvellous mansion, kind of poring voyeuristically over that series of simply appalling slides of pets. I felt he'd had a jolly good life, enough gold round his chain to buy himself, you know, any number of movie directors. You know, poor Russell, a man who's trying to make cinema.
Yeah.
I don't know. I really wanted the lawyer to lose. I found him so insufferable to watch. Yes.
That lawyer,
so I wanted Russell to lose just because the lawyer was such a horrible man. Yeah. And I disagree with you a little bit in that this is just an American phenomenon. I think the world over, image is so important. Content seems to mean nothing anymore, and this is essentially what the lawyer was pushing, you know, his cufflinks, how he was actually interrogation by cufflinks.
The idea that Russell allied himself to this ghastly sort of parody of a would-be pop star lawyer
bothered me a lot.
Went against the grain, and I think I came down very much on Guccione's side because of that.
But we never won the case, and that's surely the key.
Well, that's
a very American attitude.
That I liked again. I mean, I don't think it matters what lawyer you have if he wins your case.
I long to know, unless I missed it, how Russell got hold of Golub. I mean, of all the lawyers in New York, it was very odd that he got hold of this man, wasn't it?
I think it was his wife who actually introduced him.
I read that,
But the particular problem for Russell was presumably, I mean, he could see the escalating costs of any law case, and wouldn't you have used whatever skills? I mean, it's a marvellous example of barter. I mean, if we were chicken farmers, maybe we could find a lawyer and we'll offer him a kind of, feast of chickens.
Right, well, thank you very much. We'll move on now to Howard's Way, BBC One's long-running drama series about sailing boats and sex and various kinds of wheeler-dealers, of which the last episode of the present series was transmitted this evening. Here, Nigel Davenport, as Sir Edward Freer, pops the question in a somewhat oblique way to Jan Howard, played by Jan Harvey.
Speaking of which, this might be the appropriate moment.
What's that?
Why don't you open it and see?
Edward, it's beautiful.
And it's for you.
Why?
I've been thinking a great deal over the last few months, and, well, although it may appear that I have everything in life that I could possibly want, there's something lacking. Why don't you try it on?
Are you proposing?
Do you want me to go down on one knee?
It's just that it's come as a total shock.
So it has to me, too.
Shock to you, Lloyd Grossman?
Oh, in the words of the old blues song, my heart beat like a hammer when Sir Edward produced the bauble. The extraordinary thing about Howard's Way is that it is very much a program that is, it's terribly English. From this little clip, it looked a bit like Dallas, but in fact, it's much less glitzy. Now, we know in Dallas and Dynasty that frightfully rich people are meant to be miserable and unhappy and just thoroughly ghastly. What Howard's Way has done is to give that same treatment towards the affluent middle classes. And it really shows that middle-class existence in this country is absolutely frightful. Because here we are in the blameless south coast town of either Southampton or Lymington, wherever it's set place. And in fact, the place is a seething cauldron of every sort of sexual misbehavior, financial misadjustments. It's just a nightmare, this place. It's very much in the tradition of the Hardy-esque approach to the English countryside, where the countryside is a great onion which you keep unpeeling, and every layer stinks more than the one above it. So the whole thing about Howard's Way is, and it's a very anti-Thatcherite message, I think, it comes down very clearly and says that money cannot buy you happiness. If anything, it's going to make you miserable, and it's certainly going to break up your marriage.
On the other hand, it's great to have. What about you, Kit Hollebar?
Well, I don't know if I saw that light. I like the opening sailing sequences a lot, but from there it was touch and go. It reminded me a bunch of Victoria Wood's Acorn Antiques, where you get the kind of the phone ringing and then the looking into the camera kind of. The acting, where some people were all right, I thought was very uneven. And it was just so stagey and corny, and I don't know, I didn't...
It was the script, wasn't it, that was really bad?
Well, the script, I couldn't follow at all. I wouldn't know if it was bad or good. I didn't know what was going on. I found it impossible to get into. And then once I mean, you couldn't get into it watching one episode, but then once I had watched one episode, I didn't want to get into it. So that...
What about you, Christopher?
Well, I was absolutely hooked on tonight's episode. I mean, it really was the House of Atreus meets Thatcherism. I mean, we had everything. We had birth, the birth of a yacht. We had death at the end. I mean, a marvellous cliffhanger for what's to come, hopefully. And we had marriage, endless marriage, in fact, all the way through. I think it's superb, and I think the very artificiality of the script in which people say things to each other. Now, if you'll excuse me, now, when did you ever hear anybody ever say that? And marvellous. Thank you for your time, Sir Edward.
Yes.
I love it.
And today, an unknown designer, tomorrow, Europe.
I mean, this sheer artificiality, as Lloyd has really, I think, suggested, is what makes it a marvellous piece of popular television. Never for a second you care whether these characters are real. The more artificial they are, the more absurd and the more dressed as clothes pegs they are, the better for me.
Lloyd, you come back on that.
Well, it has quite a lot of the... I think one of the most interesting things about this series is, I mean, as Christopher has mentioned, the clothes are absolutely astonishing. I've never seen so many pairs of white shoes outside of Fort Lauderdale. The clothes that they wear, Jan, who's supposed to be a great fashion designer as well as a member of this yachting family, always races around looking as if she's wearing a cast-off spinnaker. Ken, who is the JR of the series, wears those awful shirts with epaulets and snaps and things. But to me, this program mines very much that rich vein of middle-class snobbery, rather like a Dawnford Yeats book, because everyone is always talking about going to the yacht club dance and the croquet club dinner, and men wear blazers with badges on them, for God's sake.
I think it's also astonishingly skillfully made as a piece of programming, particularly this last episode. If you've watched the series through, you see how they've learnt, apparently, enormous amounts about pace and construction. I mean, it isn't, as some people have suggested, it's Dallas by the Sea. They haven't actually simply carbon copied American glossy, ritzy soap. What they've actually done is to try and create something that is a hybrid of American pace and drama and British television drama values. And the way in which the sequences in this episode were constructed, so you had 3 short sequences about sex, 3 short sequences about money. I mean, it was like pulling a kind of slot machine handle. You knew what was going to happen, and yet you didn't quite know, and the pleasure was to see if the 3 cherries were actually going to come up and the money was going to come pouring out.
Do you think that the sea and sailing kit has got something to do with... I mean, it's got 11 million viewers. It's very, very popular.
Yes, I understand that. It reminds me a bit of, as you guys have both said, of Dallas and Dynasty, in that it is so popular. But it troubles me that programs like Dallas and like Dynasty and this one are so popular in times and areas of economic turmoil and decline.
Isn't it the same popularity as before television came in, of the pulp detective novel which you just read and threw away, and it just occupied your time for an hour or two?
And indeed Hollywood cinema. I mean, it reaches, and the point is, surely, it isn't just popular. This I think, Lloyd is absolutely right. This is a series that reaches absolutely into the heart of one of the central myths about Britain today. It's that the middle class have never had it so good. Here we have a collection of paradigms of the entrepreneurial spirit, out cutting each other's throat, making more and more money. I'm not quite sure it's as subversive as Lloyd suggests, but it reaches absolutely into the heart of what we're told Britain is in the 80s. And the audience out there recognise that. I mean, it's a living equivalent of reading the Sun newspaper.
Well, thank you very much. We'll go on lastly now to Late Night with David Letterman, an American chat show featuring David Letterman as host, and now being shown on Channel 4. In last night's program, we saw Letterman joking with the band leader, introducing guests. Last week, they were 2 comedians called Robin Williams and Carol Leifer, and reading out viewers' letters. In a filmed insert, Letterman tracked down to the store where she worked a viewer who had complained of his garb.
Are you Colleen? Are you Colleen Boyle?
Yes.
Did you write this letter, Colleen? So what's the deal with the sneakers? I don't think Merrick or Bryant would host their shows wearing high tops. Concerned about your Colleen Boyle. Colleen, stop that. Come here a minute. Here, we have this little gift for you here. This is for you. This is for the yard. We were over at your house. It's a bug light. Now, just a minute here. Now, Colleen, what we wanted to...
How do you know I work here?
Well, we wanted to talk to you about this. It says right here, you're concerned about my image. Now, do me a favor, stop making that annoying noise. Come here.
Kit Hollerbach, you've probably seen this thing in America on many occasions. What do you think about it, and do you think it's going to go here?
Well, I don't know that it will work in Britain, but the program has been around the States for 5 years, and I'm a big fan of David Letterman, because when it first came out, it was one of the first programs that took the mickey out of American TV, and in particular, the talk show format. And Letterman, I think, is a genius at this, because he has a real eye for the absurd, and he also is able to be sarcastic without ever being really cutting or condescending, and I enjoyed the program a lot. I admit readily that a lot of the references that were used, as in his stand-up, for example, in the beginning, I think he talked about I Love Lucy and a lot of American programs and American references. I admit that those might be very difficult to translate to a British audience but I love the show anyway.
Which he admits himself. I mean, I read an article which he said was astonished it was coming over here, and he said it's culturally locked, he said,
Yes.
which is quite interesting. What did you think, Christopher?
Well, I managed, I think, about an eighth of a laugh through what seemed to be an interminable farrago. I really found the only laugh I got out of it was the ones to do with Lucy, about the scientists who were trying to find if Lucy's hair colour existed in nature and couldn't. For the rest, I mean, I could see what the success is based upon. It's inverting all the standard values of the chat show. But it was indeed culturally locked, and I didn't think that he was particularly funny. I was irritated by the banter between the band leader and him. I thought the guests were crashingly unfunny and crashingly self-indulgent and boring. And at the end, I was jolly glad when the final credits rolled. And what an oblique, extraordinary ending this particular episode had, too. Suddenly, it was time to go to bed. I was very
It's
glad.
interesting you should say that, because, in fact, what we've been doing over here is we've been taking the piss out of chat shows for a very long time. So, in a way, what he's doing is nothing very original, is it, Lloyd?
No, not at all. And I thought the most interesting thing about Letterman was that in an interview he said that television's not supposed to be good. It's supposed to be bad, because if it were good, people would spend more time watching it. And I think, you know, in that case, that he's succeeded with his show, because it is genuinely bad. And I very much dislike this new cult of amateur television, where the star chats with the technicians and you see cables on the floor, and that's meant to be a critique. That's meant to be guerrilla television. I think it's just downright ineptitude.
I don't think it is, you guys. I disagree. No, I think that what he's doing, his show itself is a parody, and I haven't seen this on British TV. I haven't even seen it on other American TV programs. The show itself is a parody. You never know when he's being for real or not for real, and I think that's hilarious. I haven't seen it here.
Because unless you knew the Johnny Carson show, which is this the Letterman show seems to be a deliberate parody of, and okay, we for a brief period in Britain did have Johnny Carson, but he bombed, I mean, enormously. You wouldn't have any sense of what the parody is, and therefore it, I think, will go right over the heads of most British viewers. I mean, unless you understand that the relationship with the leader of the band is the relationship with Doc on the Johnny Carson show, unless you understand that Johnny Carson's games with his pencils is the same as Letterman's games with his index cards, unless you all understand that, you won't get the point of the parody, and it won't mean anything. And in the end, if the only meaning of this chat show is parody, and you don't understand that, well, you've got nothing out of it at all.
Because what is ultimately more potent than the parody is what it shares with other chat shows, which is that nauseating self-adoration of the star. And, you know, in that sense, even though Letterman comes out on stage and says, I have the worst hair in show business, he still is very much in the sort of Woganoid role of I am here to be adored, and the adoration of the star is the whole motivation for the chat show.
I don't see him that way. I think he has a very self-effacing style, boy next door, aw, gee shucks kind of thing, which lets him get away with taking the mickey out of these programs. I agree with you in the sense that I don't think the references and as to parody Carson seems a bit ridiculous, since most British viewers haven't seen the program.
So you don't think, Kit, that kind of show would really work here?
Well, I think it has worked with The Last Resort with Jonathan Ross. It's a very similar program, if not exactly the same kind of format, and it seems to have worked quite nicely.
What is going to happen, though, is that a lot of British viewers will look at Letterman and say, well, big deal, it's just a copy of Jonathan Ross. In fact, The Last Resort is a copy of Letterman, but, you know, as Joshua Reynolds said, genius is the child of imitation.
Lloyd Grossman, Kit Hollabaugh, and Christopher Cook, thank you all very much. A new BBC drama scheduled for showing in the new year was previewed at the London Film Festival last week. It's called The Vision. It's been made by the team that made the memorable Shadowlands, the story of the life of C.S. Lewis, and its theme is the takeover of Europe by direct broadcast satellite television. But what is the reality behind the fiction? Alison Hilliard reports.
The monopoly is coming back. A single information network, satellite television, transmitting to a continent, soon to the whole world. Only one or two networks will survive because the costs are so high. But there is a battle being fought over the skies of Europe for the hearts and the minds of a continent. Whoever wins will guide your understanding and guard your values for a generation. Now, who do you want it to be, Mr. Mariner? Hollywood? Robert Maxwell? It won't be the BBC, I can promise you that.
The Vision is the story of an assault on Europe by a new breed of invader, the satellite TV mogul. But after all the hype about satellites over the last few years, you can't help wondering if satellite television is really going to be as important as this drama makes out. These are some of the channels we can already see from Europe by satellite, and are hardly the stuff of political intrigue. A TV station from any European country can beam its programmes up to a satellite situated several thousand miles above the equator. That satellite can then relay them to homes all over Europe.
It's so difficult to control satellite television because, unlike terrestrial transmitters, satellites cover whole continents. They don't respect boundaries at all. They cover Eastern Europe as well as Western Europe. And governments are really only beginning to come to terms with the effects of that they've lost direct, immediate control over what people watch on their television screens.
At the moment, the dishes you need to receive satellite programmes are large and cumbersome like these. But experts tell us that smaller dishes the size of a dinner plate are being developed. So is the satellite revolution about to take off?
The West Germans have successfully launched their DBS satellite, the first in Europe, which will be putting out, if all goes well, within the next 3 months, 4 channels of television which will cover all of Europe. From Luxembourg, a 16-channel satellite, Astra, is due to go up in July. And then in 1989, the British DBS satellite ought to be offering 3 new channels of national television. At last, it's about to happen, and that by 1990, Europe could have as many as 40 new channels of satellite television.
Welcome to the People Channel, and broadcasting to all Europe.
And cue Mary.
And welcome from me to the first night of the all-new People Channel.
It's about a group of American organizations, we don't quite know who. They call themselves a community of interest. They come to Europe, and their first aim is to win the television audience, to get television viewers. Through the television audience, their second aim is to get power socially. Through that social power, they aim thirdly to get political influence, and to use that influence to nefarious ends.
Don't see what you expect me to do, Geoffrey. Stop them. Cancel their license to broadcast.
On what grounds? They're publicly committed to wholesome family viewing. Nobody's supposed to watch their programs. People who do want to watch pay nothing. It seems to me to be an excellent example of private enterprise at its best, filling a gap left, if I may say so, Geoffrey, by you. If the BBC gave us more family viewing and less foul-mouthed sneering, then...
Yes, but what's in it for them? Ask yourself that. Television isn't like newspapers or magazines or books. It's much, much more expensive. Ordinary people can't play. Only people who control billions of pounds. If you let the satellite channels take our audiences, the airways won't be free. They'll be taken over by big money. And that's the bullet for democracy, Richard. Bang!
The BBC has actually lost a say in satellite broadcasting for the future. It's decided that apart from putting out quality on its 2 national channels, its only role in the future is as a programme supplier. That doesn't give them much control over the shape of the television future.
So if the BBC has no control over the future of television, is public service broadcasting under threat?
Oh, I very much hope so. If you're talking about BBC and ITV and competition for viewers, I mean, I think that, as Grace said in the film, the monopoly is back. I actually think the truth of the matter is that the monopoly or the duopoly is ended. I mean, we will bring 4 national channels to this country.
Most of these satellite channels are based almost entirely on bought-in material, and often third reruns of Charlie's Angels from the States at $1,000 an hour. With the exception of BSB, which is actually committing itself to spending £100 million in its first year on programming, these channels are not originating material.
Public service broadcasting exists as an act of political will and an act of social will. And I want it to remain. I think our society is infinitely the richer for it. I think it's under threat. It's under threat because the satellite channels will go for the large audiences. They will squeeze out every other channel. Once you've not got an audience, you can't get the money, not even from the taxpayers. Who wants to pay taxes if you're not watching the BBC? Then public service broadcasting goes down the drain, and we're left with mass market television. And I think that even as a democracy, we will suffer for that.
I think that both can coexist. And in my own opinion, I think that standards will go up, not down.
The government is clearly concerned of dangers that this new technology will be used to relay pornography or violence. And because it's happening outside their territorial jurisdiction, at the moment there's not a lot they can do about it. What they are trying to do is play a full part in attempts by the Council of Europe to get a new convention which would actually open up the skies and legitimise these broadcasts, but within a regulatory framework, at least where taste and matters of taste and decency were controlled. But conventions are desperately slow affairs. There's little sign of agreement. Luxembourg, the government that's putting up the Astra satellite, is already saying it doesn't want artificial restrictions which will actually close off international broadcasters rather than encourage it. So it could be a long time away before we actually get an international framework. Mrs. Thatcher is clearly worried about this because she's starting to say things like, if any British advertisers support unsuitable channels broadcasting back into the United Kingdom, she's prepared to consider taking penal steps against them. But that begs the question, rather, if it's an American satellite or someone else's satellite coming outside British jurisdiction and is not looking for support, financial support in the UK. So theoretically, there's a chance that almost anything could be beamed at Britain from outside its own jurisdiction.
We're going to rebuild the will of a continent.
With television?
Yes, with television. People form their beliefs from what they know, and what they know today, they learn from television. It's the stories they tell each other, it's the people they admire, it's the words they use. For a generation now, your networks have been teaching people to sneer at power and authority. In America, our networks have never been afraid to nourish patriotism and the conviction that good people can be strong and can fight and can win. In America, it is television that forges the national will, and we can do the same for Europe.
Look at what happens in our elections. Look how all politicians use television increasingly as a means of getting their message across. Once television is owned by money-making consortia, of course they're going to try to use their television power to influence the political climate so that they can go on making more money. How could they do otherwise? And that's what frightens me.
What happened in that film could not happen here. They would not get any license to broadcast if they didn't say who the money was coming from. They'd have to declare it, and it would have to be non-foreign. No foreign investment can have a controlling interest, and no religious body or political body can have a controlling interest. So I think that from an authority point of view, it wouldn't be a starter.
They would have to persuade one European government to give them the satellite space, the place in orbit to broadcast from. And if they're hiring somebody else's satellite, then governments would have a say on the leasing of that satellite. If it really was the start of a new form of fascism or extremism, I think there would be very few governments in Europe who would be prepared to tolerate that, and action would be taken to prevent it.
I don't think it'll happen the way it happens in our story, but I do think that the satellite networks are going to transform our television, and I think we're going to look back on our current television as a golden age, and we're going to ask ourselves, where did it go?
This network will lie to you. At first they'll give you what you want, then they'll give you what they want, and by that time it'll be too late.
And that film will be shown on BBC Two on January the 10th. Well, next week we'll be reviewing A Perfect Spy on BBC Two on Wednesday at 9:25. It's Gary Shandling's show, BBC Two on Thursday at 10:10, and An Idea of Europe, Channel 4 on Sunday at 8:15. And lastly, I'd like to throw out a couple of bouquets. The first goes to Linda Lewis, whose nightly news reports from the Cleveland Child Sex Abuse Inquiry seem to me to have been a model of clarity and conciseness. And a word of praise, too, for some photography as stunning in its way as that of the diving osprey I showed you at the beginning of the program. It comes from Channel 4's Equinox, a documentary on the world of the modern American fighter pilot. And it's the work of cameraman Alan Palmer. Good night.
Nowadays, when a fighter pilot climbs into the cockpit of a high-performance jet, he knows he's charged with the awesome responsibility of operating some of the most complex machinery ever devised at speeds that would outstrip a rifle bullet. He will be pushed to the edge of his physical and intellectual limits, and tradition demands that he respond with the right stuff. But this image of the pilot, gleaned from the exploits of the aces of past wars, ignores the reality of aerial combat today.